next panel is really talking about Global AI Action Alliance and AI and its impact on marginalized communities. And I think this is really a point of conversation. I think it's very timely and topical that we're having this debate today, but also we're having it with an illustrious panel, as you can now see on your screen. And to introduce them to you, I'd like to welcome our moderator for this session, Firth-Butterfield, the project head of AI and ML at the World Economic Forum. Welcome to you all, and welcome, Kay.
Thank you so much, and a warm welcome to everyone for this panel on the Global AI Action Alliance, AI and its impact on marginalized communities. I'm Firth-Butterfield. I'm head of AI and machine learning at the World Economic Forum, and we actually lead the Global AI Action Alliance, or GAIA for short, which was launched in January 2021 to accelerate the benefits of AI for humanity and really serve as a global umbrella where all great ideas for making sure that AI actually benefits humanity can be lodged. So if you're one of those people with a great idea, do reach out to us. The Global AI Action Alliance is co-chaired by Veloso, the previous speaker, and the CEO and chairman of IBM, Arvind Krishna, for whom Christina Montgomery, who joins our panel today, serves as deputy. So whilst AI is accelerating rapidly worldwide, its benefits and risks, as we know, are distributed unequally across societies. And we're already seeing gaps between the AI haves and the AI have-nots. And that's why the Global AI Action Alliance is launching a major new project on AI and marginalized communities in collaboration with our Global Futures Council on AI for Humanity and the Profit AIandYou, which is led and co-founded by Susan Gonzales, who is also on our panel today. So without further ado, I am utterly delighted to introduce you to this phenomenal panel of just amazing women doing diverse things in the world of AI. So first of all, Christina Montgomery is the Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer and co-chair of the AI Ethics Board of IBM. Christina, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Kay.
Thank you. Second, we have Manuela Veloso, who is the head at JP Morgan Chase of AI research and a professor at CMU. Manuela, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
And Susan Gonzales, who, as I say, is the CEO and founder of AIandYou. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Kay. Thank you for having me.
So although I have specific questions for each of you, and I hope that we'll have time for audience questions as well, I hope that you'll all jump in with one another if you've got additions to any or all of the answers that your co-panelists give. So moving to the most basic but important question, Manuela, can you help us here? What's the difference between AI, data science, and machine learning?
Yeah, just very briefly. So AI is a science of trying to have machines exhibit basically all aspects of human intelligence. That's really what we are all about. So therefore, AI includes, as you can imagine, natural language processing, which can be done with machine learning or not. All sorts of machine vision, algorithms for planning, decision, optimization, knowledge representation, and then eventually the execution, the being part of like a system that is deployed, getting feedback. So somehow AI is not only the process of processing data and extracting patterns from data automatically, like eventually machine learning is helping with. However, machine learning is a major component of this AI kind of direction because, of course, there is no intelligence without learning. So, but I do want you to embrace the fact that AI, or understand the fact that AI includes other algorithms that may not just be a deep learning algorithm.
Super. Thank you so much, Manuela. And we're here, Susan, to talk about inclusivity and diversity. And I want you to help us think about why is an inclusive AI ecosystem necessary, please?
Absolutely. I think the best place to start is to define marginalized. So marginalized is a person or a group that has been treated as insignificant or on the periphery. So that includes women, people of color, LGBTQ, disabled, and others. We cannot afford to leave these communities behind when it comes to the development and deployment of AI. We saw what happened with broadband, right, decades ago. And we were reminded recently during the pandemic of the effects of the inequities in technologies and the ripple effects it has on the economy. So as we look ahead, and even as we work today in AI, we really do need to consider the impact and also how much we are engaging marginalized communities in the conversation. So for example, we're expecting like 75 million jobs will be displaced in 2022. At the same time, 122 million jobs will be created. So let's have that conversation. What does that look like? How does that impact marginalized communities? This is why it's important to have this conversation and to create a more inclusive experience on the development and the deployment of AI looking ahead. We just can't afford to make the same mistakes that we have in the past. There's just so much at stake.
Super, thank you, Susan. And Manuela, Vilas touched on this in the speech that he just gave, talking about bias and diverse teams. I wondered whether you could talk to us about how an inclusive AI ecosystem helps with the potential intrinsic biases within an AI system.
Very good. So AI does require people to develop algorithms and code and data to train machines. So somehow, the more diverse the team is, the more access we have to ideas that are inclusive in terms of the development of the algorithms, but also access in diversified data. So I think that people tend to think only about the data, but also the way people think is very important in how you develop these particular algorithms. So I give you an anecdotal example, which is I think it's very interesting. So when I, years ago, was working with autonomous robots, and even now at JP Morgan, working with autonomous kind of like bots, that chatbots, one of the things I realized was that the AI systems had limitations. They could not press elevator buttons if they didn't have arms. They could not may not understand all the English we speak. So there were limitations. So I introduced this concept of symbiotic autonomy, which means that these AI systems can ask for help proactively from humans. Now, maybe this asking for help, actually the New York Times wrote an article and mentioned, oh, this is probably because Manuela is a woman, that she had the solution in which the systems would ask for help and really be part of this kind of ecosystem, machine and human. So just to say that sometimes or many times, these diverse environments create approaches to how to solve problems that capture all the methods and all the thinking of our humanity, of our societies. So it's just to say that surprisingly, or it's important for us to understand that it's not just the data that's more well represented, but it's also the way in which people address problems and come up with solutions. You listen and you are surprised by seeing that people have different experiences. So the broader we go, the bigger chances we have of solving problems in novel ways and in very inclusive ways.
Yes, absolutely, Manuela. And, at the World Economic Forum, we have been working on this. And the thing that comes out of many conversations that we have with our partners is, as you say, creating that diversity of thinking around the product that you're building. And Susan, just tell us, what does having an inclusive AI ecosystem mean for you?
Well, I think taking off on following up what Manuela mentioned is, of course, it does require, and I love this example, that maybe a woman's perspective influenced, right? Which it did. We do need these diverse perspectives at the table. And there's a lot of conversation about we need more diversity in tech. And we all know that and agree. And that's taking time, and that will take some time. So meanwhile, what are we doing today? So for example, let's just say, a project team is working on a tool that will have significant impact on the communities overall, but there's a myopic perspective. There are different perspectives at the table. So is it time for companies to consider being a little more creative, for example? So maybe reach out to a leader of a marginalized communities in any given country or any given area to get the perspective on the front end, rather than waiting until a tool negatively impacts marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, and pulling it back. So it seems that looking ahead, as we wait for more diverse perspectives to be at the table, I think now is a time to get creative. And I think, going back to Gaia, it's a perfect example of thinking differently, and I want to thank, WEF and Kay for the leadership in this. And we are working with the Gaia team specifically to create best practices and resources around equity and inclusion. And this is a first, right? And so as Gaia is thinking differently, now is a time, I believe, that we need to ask companies. I mean, I get it. I get it in tech. It's about ship product, get it out the door, right, as quickly as we can. But that's not working. And so maybe now is a time to change a paradigm in the development and also in the deployment and engaging people in the conversations.
Super, thank you. So moving to companies, Christina, I know that IBM has done a lot of work on thinking about ethics or responsible AI. And just last week, we released a paper with the way in which you do this work, which you submitted to us for a deep dive by many different people. And so that openness and transparency, I think, is one way in which we can help one another move on. But my question for you is, how can companies and other organizations develop a governance structure that builds trust in AI and mitigates against bias? And what models should people look at?
Yeah, I was really actually struck by Villas's comments that he made in his keynote just prior to our panel, in particular that embedding your values into design, equating design with values, because that's very much the approach that we take at IBM. I mean, we firmly believe that to realize the full potential of new technologies, the benefits have to be felt broadly across society. And we also feel that sense of responsibility as a technology company that we need to be trusted and that we need to be responsible stewards of new technology. So that's exactly the approach that we take. We embed our values into our governance structure. We lead with those. We've got principles. We call them our principles for trust and transparency. And they are that that AI should augment humans, not replace human intelligence, that data and insights belong to their creator, and that AI technologies have to be fair, inclusive, transparent, and explainable. And so our governance structure, so to take those principles and put them into practices is really where, that absolutely has to happen. They're meaningless without that. But we look at it more as instilling a culture of AI ethics throughout the company and putting those into practice. We feel that ethical AI is everyone's responsibility here. So we centralize our governance around an AI ethics board. It's got centralized decision-making authority. It's comprised of senior leaders. It's very cross-disciplinary in nature in terms of its representation. And the board operates with both a tops-down and a bottoms-up approach in that it's overseen by a committee of senior vice presidents at IBM, but we have a network of focal points throughout the business that we call them our AI focal points. So we have touch points throughout the business that we not only hear from, but they help be sort of instilling and infusing that culture of ethics through the initiatives and through the work streams that are led by the board, but certainly not, board can't do it alone. It's this network of focal points that helps us build that out. And through that construct, we promote best practices throughout the business. We conduct internal education. And the board also leads our participation with external stakeholder groups, like our initiatives through the Global AI Action Alliance. I think also another point is that technology solutions are something that we offer as well. So it's not just our own governance model, right? But how can technology help? So we see this, for example, in toolkits that were deployed into open source around things like fairness and explainability and uncertainty quantification and the like around AI. So we don't do it alone. We've contributed those toolkits to open source so that they can be improved upon by a community.
Super, thank you, Christina. And I think that willingness to contribute to the rest of the world, great ideas that you have had, is actually so important, because IBM is able to fund all these different things that you're doing, but smaller companies are not. And so this gives them a place to start. That, Manuela, turning to you, everybody's had great ideas about this particular topic of bias and marginalized communities. But I guess the $64,000 question could be, how do we bring AI to everyone, Manuela?
So this is a very good question. And I think that we need to embrace the fact that AI is about making products that involve computing, and computers are available everywhere. So I do agree with what has been said, but we have to understand something. We have all to understand something. Somehow, it's hard to enforce good behavior with respect to AI, because AI is something that, or these computing, or these access to data, it's something that's so distributed. It's not like checking if a country has nuclear power facilities, which eventually you can go and check physically if there is some kind of nuclear power generation. Even that is hard because people try to hide it. Now imagine about using computers for face recognition inappropriately, or you name it. So the ethics and all the problems of AI, I can believe, I mean, for me, it's all about what was just mentioned, education. It has to be about bringing people aware of the needs to have different, to bring the values to the actual programming of these computers. So I think that the hard part here is, for me, not as much the actual generation of the principles, which I think it's very important to educate, but then the enforcement is also very awkward. So our hope is that education will lead people to adhere to these principles, and we can, in our local kind of communities, check that these principles are being followed. But I'm very realistic here, and I know that it will always be hard to not have people that misuse technology. So somehow, ideally, AI itself should be a way to really checking if these things are so it's almost as if we now generate AI filters for everything that's being done, so that these enforcement is also done by AI. I actually don't know how we are going to do this. I don't know how computing is going to be check its own computing, but I do think that we have to realize that AI is not a person. AI is code. AI is access to computers. AI is access to data. So it's a different, how do you say, challenge for us as technologists to really address this problem of having basically this technology being having good use of this technology. It's just going to be hard. And the more we talk about this, like we are doing here, the more we can alert people to really develop good use of the technology. That's my hope is that these education and these being open and transparent about these problems will eventually lead to much better use of AI or to very good use of AI. But yeah, anyway, so I this is my feeling as a developer.
And it's really great to have
So
you
let
as a
me add one more thing.
developer.
Let me add one more thing.
Yeah.
So, however, I also want to say for everyone that there is a lot of hope for AI because AI systems can improve over time. So somehow, as opposed to sometimes people who are extremely biased and for one reason or another, it's hard to change their minds. When we have an AI system and you build it correctly, maybe it doesn't do the right ethical decision today, but if we inject feedback and if we inject more data, tomorrow it might be better. So we have this big hope, and I want to how do you say share this big hope that AI systems are capable of improving over time. And so please, we should not get disappointed if some AI system currently is not ideal and optimal. But what we should aim is at AI systems that can get feedback, can be retrained, can be adjusted, can incorporate more ideas from more diverse teams. So we should be in this dynamic view of AI rather than this one-shot view of AI. This is it. We cannot do anything about it. No, it's not true. We can do a lot about improving our own AI systems.
Thank you, Manuela. And I think that that demonstrates the importance of having diverse minds, not just on panels like this, but also in terms of product and understanding one another. Christina, one way we can try to bring AI to everyone is having lots of companies getting involved in partnerships with outside organizations like the Global AI Action Alliance. Where do you think the action's most needed?
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with Manuela and with everything we're hearing, today so far. I think that AI can play a critical role in helping to address so many global problems too. And Phyllis covered this as well in his keynote. But where I think we are, I talked about how at IBM we're embedding ethical thinking in our work and trying to hold ourselves accountable. We're imposing our own sort of guardrails and aligning around those values. And I think a lot of companies are really trying to do the same thing, but it's the how, right? It's taking it from those principles and translating it into practices. That is a challenge for companies today. And I think that's really where the World Economic Forum and Gaia can really, really be helpful in terms of helping us to examine what best practices are in the space of ethical technology, right? And helping us to scale best practices around the globe to really translate what we are all saying about the potential and the values and human-centered aspects of what AI should look like and be designed around, but in a way that takes those high-level concepts and tells companies, all right, here are some concrete steps and tests, and brings together also critically multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder groups to have those conversations. I mentioned we don't believe we can go it alone. So we do participate in multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary studies and groups on a regular basis. We contributed to the Vatican's Rome call for AI ethics. We participated in the EU high-level expert group as their guidelines for ethical technology were being established. And I think, from a progress perspective, again, in terms of moving from those principles and those concepts, how should we align into practices, WEF and Gaia could be hugely impactful.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Christina. And certainly over the last 4 years, I suppose, that I've been leading the work at the forum, we have been trying to think about how do we provide tools that allow us to operationalize ethics. Most recently, for example, on thinking about how facial recognition would be used by law enforcement. It may be likely to be banned in Europe, but it certainly isn't around the world. And so sort of creating some of those tools to really help people think wisely, we hope, about these issues. And talking about thinking wisely, Susan, we're actually running out of time. We've only got 5 minutes left. So briefly, how can we level playing fields for marginalized communities?
Well, I think two ways. One is, we've been talking a lot about corporate principles, and those things are great to hear. The other half of that story, though, is that how do we educate the actual end user, if you will? How do we help marginalized communities understand? Let's start with AI basics, right? Marginalized communities tend to use their phones more, let's say, to apply for a loan. How does that impact the AI tool to decline or accept, for someone to get a mortgage? I mean, that's the detail of which we need to engage the community to understand how these tools are working or not working. But most importantly, we need to change the narrative. So if we search today, if you search AI and marginalized communities or people of color, you will get millions of hits on bias. We're really not talking about the tools that you all are creating that are actually good for the community. How can they help small business owners? That's where we need to start, I think, to level the playing field, is to have these conversations, to highlight AI for good, and to help people understand AI basics, and let's say job training or job upskilling. If robotics augment people, what does that mean, right? What do people need to know to grow with AI and these new technologies? And I think that's the other part of the conversation that we really need to have, is once the tools are out the door, then what, right? So I think it's really engaging communities in the dialogue looking ahead.
Absolutely. And I think engaging the community is one of the things that we most struggle with all around the world. We were very lucky to do some work with New Zealand, where they actually created a conversation between government and citizens on, use of AI in government. But in larger communities and countries, it just becomes so much more difficult. So Christina, we're seeing a lot of new innovative technologies being introduced. How does IBM think about using or introducing new technologies to the world? I think you've covered some of this, but what are the core values and practices that you think organizations need to introduce when talking about responsible development and introduction of new technologies? And again, we've only got 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so I'll answer it real quickly. I mean, I think in general, when we think about new technologies, whether it be AI or looking out ahead, neurotechnology, for example, quantum computing, we look at it from the perspective that, will the technology and how will we ensure that it aligns with our values? But are we also deploying it? Is there a purpose? What is the purpose for deploying this technology? How can we deploy it in a responsible and trustworthy way? So very holistically, we think about not can we do something, but should we do something when we're deploying a new technology? And then I'll just pick up quickly on a point that Susan made about teaming with marginalized communities and more work that needs to be done there, and the benefits that AI can offer in those communities. A plug for IBM's Science for Social Good program. That's exactly the kind of thing that we do. So we also holistically, in that culture of ethics, we have a whole program where we are partnering with NGOs and local communities for things like, one of our recent projects was a cognitive financial advisor for low-wage workers, and there our research team worked with an organization called Neighborhood Trust Financial Partners to develop predictive models. So I think if we can demonstrate more about the benefits while ensuring that we're avoiding those bad uses of AI, it's going to help the understanding and the adoption of responsible technologies.
That's wonderful, and great to hear that you're doing that sort of work. So I have lots of other questions for you all, but we have sadly only about 1 minute left. And so I think Manuela, talking about AI and marginalized communities, is there actually a way that we could use AI to reach out to marginalized communities? And when we're thinking about AI, is there actually a difference between marginalized communities and other fields?
Yeah, so let me just end very briefly by saying yes. One concrete thing that we should all do, and I love the way that Susan and Christine have, I've learned a lot from listening to you too. I really think that it's also about concrete steps. For example, my mission is to have connections with universities. So you reach out to really much more than just these three top like universities. You go broad. When I hire like at my AI group in JP Morgan, we are currently 50-50, women and men, and a lot of diverse members of the teams. So we all have to make an effort. We all have to reach out. And in fact, it's not about big principles, but it's that daily moment in which you have to make the decision. Who do you invite as a speaker? Who do you actually put in this panel? Who do you introduce to the business person? Who do you go about funding for a master's degree? It's all full of little steps. And those are where we can have a big difference. And I believe that AI can help. We are doing a lot of work in trying to identify, in fact, this particular kind of like people we can reach out to that maybe they didn't used to be in our circles, but then they now magically are part of our circles. So, just think about AI to be able to give you more information than the information that you actually have access to. So you have to make an effort to have AI educate us also in the decisions we need to take daily. Everyone in any company, in any place where you have to make decisions about people, about where to go, about eventually how do you develop your products. So I just want to say that the outcome is the sum of all these little decisions that we face daily.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect conclusion for this panel, especially when you said you've got to think about who you invite to speak. Inviting, I think, three very wonderful women was a stellar thing to do for this panel. Thank you all so much. And now handing back to the stage in Amsterdam.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jane.
Nice.
No.
Very nice.